Welcome back to my channel. Today we're going to be continuing with part 2 of the video showing you how to paint monochromatically in black and white. So what I'm doing here, if you recall from the last video, which there'll be a link up in the corner, we finished the guitar and now we're moving on to working on the hand. So what I'm doing here is I'm continuing on with adding in shadows. So you'll notice that all of my shadows that are on the hand will tend to be on the warmer side of the spectrum. And that's where I'm using the yellow oxide to warm the grays that I'm using. And I'm starting out again with the darker colors, same as I did on the guitar, so that I know how light to go when I get to the lighter areas. So here you'll see me taking the black and mixing in some of the yellow oxide to warm it. And you hopefully should be able to see quite clearly the difference between the warms and the cools now. And the more you look at it, the more you'll be able to see that difference. Remember that my light source is coming in from the left-hand side where it's brightest down where his fingers are on the guitar. So the right side of his hand will be in shadow. You want to look for any areas where the shadows will be darker and start putting those in. Look for areas where there's veins, that sort of thing, so that you can start bringing form to the hand. Now here you'll see me mixing up a cooler black, and I'm using a cooler black because I'm going into the deep shadows of his hand. So you'll notice once again I used the black and the red violet, and then I added in some of that phthalo green blue, which takes some of the redness out of the violet so that it doesn't make the tone purple, because I still want it to be a grayscale monochromatic black and white. And the violet will cool it, but I don't want to actually turn the color violet. And I'm using that cool shadow in the deepest areas so that it will contrast better with the warmer shadows up on his hand closer to the light. And I hope you can see when I'm putting the cool color right next to that warm color, I hope you can see that difference. You'll see it even more clearly when you actually paint it yourself, because there's a difference in computer monitors and that sort of thing. But hopefully you can see it quite clearly when you mix them yourself. It does take time to develop the ability to see the warms and the cools, so you just have to work at it over time and practice. Now I do go back and forth sometimes to other areas of the painting. Once I have a tone that I like, I'll go in and I'll use it in other areas of the painting as well. So this was a nice dark shadow tone, so I went back and I started using it on areas of the guitar as well. I'm deepening the shadows right by his hand there so that there's more contrast. So like I mentioned previously, the contrast in this painting is going to be very important in making the light seem lighter and the dark seem darker. Especially when you're doing a black and white monochromatic, the contrast is very important in giving you the effect that you want. Now what I've done here is I've added a little bit of water to that paint. The paint had gotten dry in that area, and one nice thing about the heritage paints is that you can reconstitute it with water for a couple of hours. So rather than mixing a new color when that was the tone that I really wanted, I went ahead and I just reconstituted that little bit of warm gray over there. Keep in mind where the shadows of his hand would be on the guitar. You can see I've got the shadow of his finger there, and then this is also where the shadow of his hand would be, what I was putting in there now. And once I put in some of those shadows, I'll sometimes take them back out with a little bit of the light again. And that allows me to put in the shadow. I put it in a little bit larger, and then I take part of it back out with the light, and that makes it so that I can get the nice thin shadows without having to change my brush. The more tones you add in, the more interest you're going to have, which is another nice thing about going over with layers like this. So I've already put in one tone, and now I'm going over with another tone, and that's just adding more interest. Here I've decided to darken down that shadow of his finger a little bit, because once I added in that other shadow, I found that I needed to darken it a little. So you can see me slowly building the tones, going from the dark to the light in this case. Now here I'm taking some of my warmer dark gray, and I'm putting in the veins on the back of the guy's hand. And this will also help with making the knuckles stand out. So I'm getting all these shadow areas in first, but I'm keeping this area warm because it's on the back of his hand, which would be the closest to the light. Even though it's a shadow area, it's a warm shadow. You'll also get some interesting contrast when you put those warm shadows right next to the cool shadows. You get a temperature contrast, which is another contrast that adds interest to the painting. Now here I've made a lighter gray that's warmer, and I'm going to start adding more of the mid-tones to the painting. Now here I'm darkening that down and making a bit of a half tone. And a half tone is basically just a tone that's between the two. So I've got my dark tone and I've got my light tone, and then I mix them together to make something about halfway in between. And what that does is that tends to soften your transitions from your darks to your lights. And as the artist, you have to choose how much softening you want to do of those transitions. You want to always be thinking about where you're going to be looking at the painting from. So it's good to take a step back, get up and stand back and look at your painting from further away, because what looks like a large stroke when you're right at the painting, when you step back, your eye is going to actually do some visual blending on that. So you want to always be thinking about that, so that because if you over soften all of your lines, then when you step back, everything is going to visually blend together. So you want to keep some of those larger contrasts. And because in this painting I chose to have quite an intense light source in the one area, what I'm doing, you'll see here that I'm coming up against that shadow with a quite light color. And that larger contrast is going to add a lot more interest. If you had your light source, say, further away, a little bit softer light source, you wouldn't come right up against that dark with a light color like that. But in this case, because that's the decision that I made in the style of painting that I wanted to do, I am not going to tone that down so much. I'm going to keep that deep shadow in there. So here I'm taking the white and I'm adding in a little bit of gray and then the warm yellow. And I'm going to start putting in my highlights now. Now that I've determined how deep the shadows are going to be, I know how light I can come with my highlights. I want to keep this very warm now, which is why I've got the yellow oxide in there, because I want to keep these areas that are closest to the light as the warmest part of my painting. So again, you want to be paying attention to your perspective here, because you want to have your light source really strong, and you want to have your shadows showing where the hand is bent. Your shadows will show where the fingers are bent, where the knuckles are, all that sort of thing. So you want to be paying really close attention to where the light and the highlights are going to hit. And you see I'm adding in some extra light right in this area because the light would be shining on that part of his hand, but it would only be hitting a certain portion of it. And that extra light in that area right next to the dark shadow is going to add even more contrast. And like I said, in this painting, contrast is what's going to give you all of your interest. Having that bright light right alongside the veins on his hand too is going to make those stand out more and add some interest there. Now here I'm putting in a bit of a darker tone, just slightly darker, because I felt like the one that I had there was a little bit too light. So you want to constantly be evaluating the tones next to each other. So you'll have a light tone and a dark tone, and you'll evaluate them and decide whether they mesh well together or if you need to darken something, that sort of thing. Because as soon as you put one tone down and then put another lighter tone next to it, that law of simultaneous contrast that we talked about before takes in effect. So if I have a really dark color right next to a medium gray, that medium gray is going to look lighter than if I put it right next to a light gray. So you always have to be paying attention to your tones and thinking about your simultaneous contrast. And that is why I will go in and then adjust tones. So if I think I've made something too light, I'll adjust it, make it a little bit darker, and vice versa. And you can see as we add these different tones, the hand itself is starting to take more shape. You're starting to get the roundness of the knuckles by using the different tones, the light in one area, and as it goes darker around the side, that sort of thing. You're starting to get the depth of the veins in the hand by using the contrast of those darks and lights, and the hand itself is starting to really take shape. And you'll notice whenever I make a new gray in this area, I'm adding that yellow oxide to it to warm it, because I want the hand to be quite warm. So now that I added in a bunch of my lights, now I'm going back to another darker color and I'm adding more of that. And by bouncing back and forth between the darks and the lights, I'm allowing myself to get a better visual idea of how the colors are going to look next to each other. And each tone I add, again, adds more interest to the painting. And some of those dark shadows that I had taken out with the light, I'm going to add back in now, based on whether I feel like I took out too much of that shadow or not. And anywhere where I want to soften the shadow to the light transition, like I'm doing right here now, I'm using a half tone again. So I'm going somewhere kind of between that shadow color I had put on, the lighter shadow there, and the really bright area. And I'm adding in a half tone, which will soften that area. Notice that when you paint the knuckles, you need to think about the shape of them. Think about them as being somewhat rounded, especially when the hand is bent like this. So you're looking at it almost as though you're painting a round object, a ball, and you're putting your shadows and your lights as though you were painting an object like that. And that's one helpful thing when you're painting a hand or a body part, is to really just break it down into the basic shapes that are involved in it, and that will help you to really see where your lights and your shadows should be. So think about, the fingers as cylinders, and think about the bent knuckles as spheres, that sort of thing, and that will really help you with determining where to put all your shadows. Also, I highly recommend studying a lot of reference photos. You can find a lot of photos online that you can just study, take photos of people's hands, that sort of thing. If there's something that you struggle with drawing, practice it more. So I've often struggled with drawing hands and drawing people and that sort of thing. So I have a whole sketchbook that I've devoted to practicing drawing those. And so I'll when I'm sitting down, watching TV or whatever, I'll pull up my sketchbook and I'll just work on drawing hands, or I take a lot of photos of hands and that sort of thing, and then I look at them and I try and pay attention to where's the lights, where's the shadows, how long are the different parts of the fingers typically, what shape are the knuckles, that sort of thing. And the more you practice it, the better you'll get at drawing them and painting them. This is an interesting area of the hand there, because his fingers are bent quite differently because he's playing that guitar. And when you're playing a bass guitar like that, your fingers will be bent in a way that that is not overly natural. So you got to pay attention to that when you're figuring out how your hand is going to look as well. So if you find a reference photo of somebody, say, playing a guitar, you'll be able to get a really good view of how those fingers would actually look. So I continue to paint in and out of the shadows. I put in more shadows. I paint some light in over top of them. I add halftones, that sort of thing. And that's what I'm just going to continue doing until I'm done the hand here. Now here I'm taking some pure white and I'm adding the warmth of the yellow to it. And this is one of the only places now where you'll see me taking that almost pure white. I'm taking just a tip of the gray in there, just to keep it from being pure white, because I don't want very many areas of that pure white on the painting. And here I'm going in now and I'm picking out the spots where the light will be hitting it the hardest, the main highlight areas. And I'm putting that in with that, it'd be about a value 9 to a 10, about a 9.5 probably, because I added that little touch of gray to it. But I'm going in and I'm making the lightest parts of the painting now. And you'll notice when I put that real light color up next to those veins, they really stand out. And adding in those highlights now is going to really define where your light source is coming from. But I hope you can see how if I had come in and made these areas light to begin with, I wouldn't know how light I could go. By doing the darks first, I set it up so that I'm only using this really light color to highlight areas, and I'm not filling in this whole hand with these really light areas, because what that would do is that would really flatten and wash out the painting. So now I'm just using that light color for the extreme highlights instead of having areas of the hand that I have as a darker gray with that really light color. And that's something to keep in mind regardless of what you're painting. This would be the area, like say if I'm painting a rose, this would be the area where I'm adding the final highlights to the petals that are closest to the light. And that is really important, to not go to that really light color too fast, because you will wash everything out if you do. So darks first, and then slowly move toward the lights and let simultaneous contrast do its job. So here you notice that I've made another half tone. I'm going from that lighter shadow to my bright white, and I'm putting in a half tone, and that's going to add a lot more interest by adding in that extra tone, and it's also going to soften that transition. The further I move away from my light source, the darker I'm going to get. As you can see here, I've moved further away from the light source again, so I'm darkening it down again. And that dark color right next to the light string is going to make quite a difference. You can see what I'm painting in now is actually the shadow of the strings on the guitar. Because the light source is so bright, those strings will be casting a shadow. So you always have to also be paying attention to where your shadows are going to be cast, especially when you have a very strong light source. Now I'm going back, now that I've added that light source and the extreme light to the hand, I'm going to go back now and add it on to any areas of the guitar that would have the light hitting them directly. Notice that the angle that you hold your brush at as well is going to change the look of the strokes that you're making. So if right here I'm holding my brush pretty much on the chisel so that I can get the thin lines of where the light would be hitting right next to the veins. And that's going to give a different effect. Holding the brush that way is going to give a different effect than if I held it flat. You'll also find that the direction of your strokes is going to make a difference. So as I come down the knuckles, I'm going to kind of round those strokes. As I come down the fingers, I'll have my strokes going the length of the fingers. And that direction of your strokes is going to make a difference in how your painting looks. That's called your brush calligraphy, and each person is going to have their own brush calligraphy that they develop over time. And that's what adds interest to the painting, is your individual brush calligraphy. You'll notice quite often in this part now, when I'm adding in this detail, I'll make a stroke and then I'll kind of stop and think about it and look at where I want to make the next stroke. And taking that time when you're onto this detail stage is quite important. You want to actually give yourself time to really look at it and think about it and decide where you want to add the interest next. Here I'm mixing up that cool black again, and then I'm going to lighten it. So I'm making a cool gray, and if you compare that to the grays that we've been using, you can definitely see that there's quite a difference between the cool gray and the warm gray. But I'm using that phthalo green blue to take that purple out of it and keep it as a gray, because this is a monochromatic painting, so I want to, for the most part, keep it black and white and various shades of gray. I will add a little bit of the phthalo blue sometimes to my deeper shadows and my cooler shadows, because I like to have just that tinge of blue in there. It's just a personal preference of mine. You don't have to do that. So I'm going back to detail work again. I'm adding in a few more lines on the guitar, that sort of thing, to add in that extra shape. Since I like that tone with a little bit of blue in it, I'm going to add it in a few other areas in the shadow there. I'm again darkening down this shadow by his hand because I want more contrast there. I want that to be the darkest area of the painting, aside from the area just behind the guitar on the right hand side. I'm making sure that my paint is thick where I want it to be thick as well, versus some of the paint that I had put on at the very beginning was fairly thin. So now I'm going into this area and I'm thickening that, and I'm getting rid of any of the streaks that were in the paint that I don't want to be there. This is all in the finishing stages of the painting now, where I'm just going in and I'm adding the detail and I'm making sure that I'm happy with all my brush strokes, that sort of thing. Here I'm making that dark black again, the cool black with a little bit of blue in it, so that I can just darken down this area again. But I'm making it with that touch of blue, which again is just a personal preference. I like to have a little bit of blue in my shadows sometimes. That's just something you'll have to try and see if you like. It's not something that is necessary to painting with the temperature and everything. The blue is just an extra touch that I like to add. It also helps me keep those darker areas really dark, because the blue won't lighten up the paint at all, whereas sometimes the violet lightens it a little bit. So if I want it to be really dark, quite often I'll use that blue to just keep it really dark, because that phthalo blue is a strong dark color. And when I add the phthalo blue and the violet together, it makes a really dark purple that I add to the black. And if I don't add the phthalo green blue in, then it will have a bit more of that dark purple tinge to it. And so that's another decision that you can make. Do you want it to be entirely monochromatic, just, black and white and shades of gray, or do you want to have those little tinges of color in there in some places for interest? And that's just a decision that you'll have to make on your own painting, and decide whether you like it one way or the other. You can try it both ways and see what you like. When you're doing the blacks in an area like this, you can choose some as well if you're going to transition from the cool to the warm, and how close you're going to get to that light source before you change it to the warmer color. So I kind of, to add interest, I moved some of the cooler color back into that area to just add some more interest. Here I'm darkening down this shadow area again, back here where his shirt would be behind the guitar. And just adding in some more shadow colors in there. But I don't want to have it as dark as the neck of the guitar, because I want that contrast to allow the guitar to stand out from the background. So now I've taken my smaller brush. This is a small liner brush. It's not the script liner now, but it's a smaller liner brush. And I'm going to use that to add some of the details. I put a little bit of extender in it to help make it slide better, and then I'm rolling my brush through the paint to keep it at a point. And this is how I'm going to add the highlights onto my strings. So I'm not using that script liner, which would be a little bit harder to control because it's so long. I'm using the short liner, and that's going to allow me to have a lot more control over where I put the paint on this highlight on the strings. And you'll notice that I took pretty much pure white and then I just warmed it with the yellow in order to give my highlights on the strings, because that's an area that I want to really stand out. Now here I've actually taken pure white without any of the yellow in it. So this is pretty much a value 10 now. It's on, I've got it on the edge of my yellow, so it might pick up a little bit of that. But I'm putting in this value 10 now to really make those strings stand out in the area where the light would be hitting them the most. So you notice that I did that on that first string, which is directly where the light is hitting. Now here I'm graying that down, and then I'm going to take it in and I'm going to put a shadow side on some of the strings. Once again, keeping in mind that strings are round, so they're like long cylinders, so you want to treat them that way when you're doing your shadows and your lights on them. You want them to be able to look round. Here on this one here, which is over in the shadow area, I'm using that gray to make the highlight. But because it's against that dark, it looks like a highlight, whereas if I put that, when I put that on the first string, it's a shadow. And I'll come down to my shadows there and I'll just give a little bit of a touch of the color to it so that you can tell that the strings are going through there, but because the shadows are so dark, you're not going to actually see them. And I'm not worrying too much in some of these areas about trying to keep those lines too thin, because I can always go back in with the black and thin the lines out. You won't often see me using a brush this small for the detail work. I tend to prefer to use a larger brush and use the edges of it. But because in this painting I'm painting a mechanical object, being the guitar, I want to make sure that I am keeping my lines relatively straight and a little bit more perfect than I would if I was painting something in nature. When I'm painting something in nature, I don't want perfect edges and perfect lines. I want them to have some of that, the difference in the brush strokes and that sort of thing in them, because they're not a man-made object. When I'm painting a man-made object, I'll tend to go down to a finer brush like this to make sure that I get the very fine straight lines and all the little detail lines versus just letting it look more natural. And that's part of being an impressionist painter versus a realist painter. People who paint in realism tend to go down to a lot more super fine detail, whereas being an impressionist painter, I want to give you the impression of what it looks like and not actually go in and do all that little detail. Now you see here I'm taking that black with my fine brush and I'm going back in and I'm thinning out the strings where I feel like I've gotten them too thick. I'm also going in and I'm adding a deeper shadow to the back side of the strings in this light area so that they will really pop forward. You notice again I'm using that contrast. I've got the super light on the one side and the really dark on the other side, and that's going to add extra contrast to those strings and really make them pop, because the strings and the fingers are really the highlight of this painting. Now I'm going back in up here on the other end of the guitar and I'm using that black to correct the thickness of that string. And this is again why I said I don't worry too much about getting the strings perfect when I'm putting the light in, because I can just go back with the dark and correct any of that. It's a lot easier to cover up an area with dark than it is to lighten an area. You'll notice I'm kind of taking that dark color and I'm just kind of lightly brushing it over some of the areas of these strings, because I want them to recede, because of they're not the highlight of the painting. The highlight of the painting is down around the hand. So I want the strings in this area to recede a bit. So I'll put a little bit of water or extender into it as well and really just kind of glaze over those strings to set them back a little bit more. Here in the areas where those strings are in shadow, I'm making sure that I darken them down just a little bit. And this fine detail work, you can spend as long as you want on it. Depending on the painting and the size of the painting, you can spend hours doing a lot of this fine detail work. You just have to decide how much time you want to spend on it. Deciding when you're done a painting is something that you have to figure out for yourself when you're happy with saying that it's done and that you don't want to make any more changes. What I do for myself is, once I've put my signature on the painting, then I call it done and I tell myself I can't keep making changes to it. If my signature's on it, it's done. I got to move on to the next painting. So that's something that I do personally, because I know I can tend to fiddle a lot with the paintings and just play around with the fine details forever if I don't pay close attention to it. So that's just a rule that I've made for myself. You'll have to figure out what will work for you. Here I'm making that warmer black again, because I'm coming back into my light areas and I'm just defining these lines a little bit better, filling in any areas that need to be fixed up, that sort of thing, with my fine brush now. But again, I'm always paying attention to my temperature, because now I'm back in the light, so I made a warm black. Here I'm adding in some more of the fine details on the guitar, using the little bit lighter color there. Deciding how far into that shadow area I'm going to go with that. Adding some more fine details onto the hand using my small brush. And you'll notice one thing that I've done in this painting, and I do it in all my paintings, is I generally start with the biggest brush and then I work my way towards eventually doing the finer details with the smaller brush. And the reason why I do that is because I like to I use that big brush for the blocking in, and I'm not focusing too much on the details yet at that point. And as I get down into the finer and finer details, I'll either lower the size of my brush or I'll tend to use different areas of the brush. So if I'm using like a flat brush, I'll use the corners and the edges of it once I start getting into the details, instead of using the whole area of the brush. And it's a way to just keep yourself thinking detail work. Now I'm doing the fine details. Now, you want to be careful about just always going to the smallest brush possible, because that will take some of the interest out of your painting. A lot of this fine detail work is it just takes time, but in the end it will make your painting look just have that extra something to it. And remember, when you're doing your detail work, keep in mind the warms and the cools still. You still want to be warming and cooling your lights and shadows. That temperature contrast that you've been working on through the whole painting is really important to keep going. Here I'm adding a little bit of the warmer black back into that cool shadow, just to add a little bit more contrast, especially in the areas where it's coming out of the deep shadow, like the areas there along his knuckles. We're coming out of the deep shadows, so I can warm it up a little bit more. But that just adds some extra contrast to your shadows as well. Now I'm going back to my bigger brush again, as I finished that detail work. And here I've made a warm, dark shadow. And now I'm going back in and just adding any areas that I feel need to be brought out extra. So here I'm going back in with this dark shadow, and I'm adding more contrast beside his hand, because I really want that hand to pop out of the painting. And where after painting the hand, I realized that I hadn't made that shadow dark enough, because the backside of his hand was kind of disappearing into that shadow. So by going back in and darkening that now, it's going to make the contrast against his hand pop off of the painting a little bit better. And that's, again, with monochromatic paintings like this, you're constantly judging your values next to each other, because of that law of simultaneous contrast. Every time that you put one tone next to another tone, it's going to change the look of that tone. So you're always making changes and modifications to your tones based on how they look next to another tone. Sometimes I'll use my finger like this to just smooth an area, kind of blend it. If I feel like I need to take down an edge, that sort of thing, but I don't want to do it with the brush and a tone, I can just use my finger to kind of go through it, and then that makes it almost into a bit of a half tone. See, here I'm creating a half tone with my finger by rubbing off some of that paint that I just added. It's just another way to make a half tone without actually putting the tone on. And in order to do that, you need to have good quality paint. The heritage paints do that really well. It's basically, I'm doing what's called shearing the paint with my finger. If you're using thin, cheap paints, you're not going to be able to get that effect by doing that. Here I'm using it to just add some extra interest to the guitar. And now I'm going to go back in with my dark shadow and go over that edge where I made it more jagged than I wanted it to be. And all that adds interest to your brush calligraphy, using your fingers, using the brush in different ways, using different sizes of brushes. All of that is going to add to your brush calligraphy. And you'll notice I'm making sure that I don't cover over that highlight that I put on the guitar, because I want to make sure that the light is hitting that spot. So you always have to be paying attention to where your light is hitting. And you see how much more interest that gives to the guitar now that I've added in those other brush strokes and the extra brush calligraphy with my fingers. So that is the end of the painting. Now I'm just going to put my name on it, and I'm going to call that done. And I hope you really enjoyed this, and please let me know down in the comments if you have any questions about how I did the black and whites, and why I did any certain tones in different areas. And let me know if you've ever painted a monochromatic painting, and if you learned any lessons from it. Hope you enjoyed this painting, and we'll see you on the next one. Don't forget to like and subscribe.